Hey there, fellow sojourners, and welcome back to another edition of Appropriate in the Culture. Today's episode is part one of a series as we go through all the Oscar-nominated films for Best Picture. Yes, I watched all of them, so you don't have to. You're welcome. I'm Pastor Shane, and I'll be a member of the Academy today as we appropriate some culture. With the Oscars coming up on Sunday, it's time for our review of all the nominees, starting with my rankings from worst to best. At number 10, we have Maestro, a true love story chronicling the lifelong relationship of conductor-composer Leonard Bernstein and his actress wife. The basic theme of the film is it's hard to be married to a homosexual deviant, even when you knew he was a sexual deviant before you married him, and even though he's a super talented sexual deviant. The film is overly long, plotting, light on plot, and thoroughly unlikable. It seems to only exist because Bradley Cooper really liked putting on this sort of affectation, and so wrote an entire screenplay that would allow him to keep talking in this manner. And it's a good reminder that actors are really better at reciting words that they've read rather than writing the words. Cooper really should stick to pretending to be a talking trash panda. It's a more fitting role than pretending to be a scribe. The only way in which this film succeeds is in making me really dislike Leonard Bernstein, which I'm not sure is what they were going for, but it's really the only takeaway for someone with a soul, or moral compass, or modicum of human decency. Now, on a technical level, there were some nice elements, compelling composition, excellent cinematography, some fantastic makeup, some not-so-fantastic makeup, but in the end, like Leonard Bernstein the person, the film is bad. Just bad and rotten. Now, maybe one day, if I get diagnosed with cancer and Bradley Cooper shows up to take care of me, maybe then I'll find a way to forgive him for this film. But I doubt it. Next, Poor Things. I hated this film. It's better than Maestro in that there are moments of interest and there's a basic conceit that could have been intriguingly explored if the writers had philosophical or intellectual depth greater than a kiddie pool. The film stars Willem Dafoe, Mark Ruffalo, and Emma Stone as herself. That's a funny joke if you've seen the movie, which I would not recommend because this film is, in a word, repulsive. It's repulsive in its gratuity, it's repulsive aesthetically, it's repulsive thematically. Its least repulsive quality is in its invoking of Frankenstein as an ethically challenged scientist reanimates a recently deceased pregnant woman's corpse by transplanting her brain with the brain of her unborn child. It's alive, and yes, that is the least repulsive or monstrous thing about the film. From there, we follow the development of this infant mind in the body of a mature woman as she navigates and explores the complexities of her world. It's like Big if Tom Hanks became a French prostitute. And really, it's about becoming a woman, which means freeing yourself from all the various shackles that the world seeks to entrap women with. So she frees herself from an overprotective father, liberates herself from a toxic, jealous boyfriend, and finally, in the climactic scene, she frees herself from the prison of a gun-wielding psychotic husband. And she comes into her own by exploring her sexuality and reading philosophy. And mostly the sex stuff, because sexual liberation is the pinnacle of profundity from the superficial, animalistic writers of Hollywood. In the end, though, she is a fully formed woman with a male suitor, a female lover, and she reads philosophy and is a doctor, which is the only possible outcome when you have so much empowering nudity. You go, girl. Next, The Zone of Interest, which is quite the misnomer as it's terribly uninteresting. Here's the synopsis. Auschwitz Commandant Rudolf Haas and his wife Hedwig strive to build a dream life for their family in a house and garden beside the camp. Now, if that sounds interesting, it even fails to live up to that. This is a movie with a setting, but no plot. And the setting is interesting. You get this cute little house with a garden and a nuclear family doing normal family stuff right up next to the most notorious Nazi concentration camp. A lot of long shots, mumbled dialogue, mundane moments, and it's all supposed to be shocking to us. But really, the most shocking thing is how incredibly sophomoric the thinking of these writers must be, because they seem to think that it's going to blow our minds when we find out that the perpetrators of the Holocaust were just human beings. What? You mean they had families? And homes? And did mundane, normal stuff? What? Yeah. That's not mind-blowing to anyone who's thought about the human condition for more than 5 seconds. Rather than blow anyone's mind, all you've done is reveal that you've been an incredibly thoughtless person for most of your life. Next, Barbie. The most controversial and talked about movie of the summer. People have wildly different takes on this film. Is it a feminist masterpiece, or is it a subtle critique of the inadequacies of feminism, as some people have also argued? Here's the truth. The reason why this has been something of a Rorschach test for viewers is because the film is completely and totally confused. It's confused on audience, it's confused on tone, it's confused on plot, it's confused on rules, it's confused on motives, it's confused. It's a giant, giant mess. They have no idea who this movie is for. Is it for little girls, people who play with Barbies? Because, you got a lot of innuendos, vagina jokes, and a ridiculous amount of the word patriarchy to really fit with that demographic of girls who are playing with Barbie dolls. But if it's intended for more older, sophisticated audiences, you got a bunch of slapstick that seems like it's geared to entertain 6-year-olds, like when Will Ferrell is running around at Mattel headquarters. It's confused in audience, it's confused in tone. So you have Ken and Barbie coming out of Barbie world into the real world, and that could be a fun fish out of water scenario where the Barbie world is in stark contrast to the real world. But it's not. A Mattel headquarters looks, acts, feels nothing like the real world. And maybe you could say, well, Mattel is a bridge to Barbie Land, so it's understandably more whimsical. But it's not. That's not the rules of the film. And then throw in some cartoonish car chases, and the real world doesn't really look like the real world, and so is not much of a contrast to Barbie Land. It's confused tonally. It's confused in its plot. Barbie is having an existential crisis, and so must go out into the real world and find the real-life girl who is causing her problem and make her feel better. But to do that, she has to overcome the Mattel Corporation that wants to send Barbie back to Barbie Land. But she finds the girl or woman, but it turns out it doesn't actually solve anything, so she goes back to Barbie Land, but the Mattel people want to stop her from going back to Barbie Land. Wait, what? Anyway, Ken went back to Barbie World earlier, and he institutes the patriarchy, and the women are fine with it, but not really, and so Barbie must wake them up from the patriarchy because they're not really happy with it, even though they think they are, and so we have to set Barbie Land back to what it was with some overtures to the Kens. See, normally, especially in children's programming, you have a protagonist, and the protagonist has a goal, but there is something prohibiting the protagonist from obtaining that goal, and that's called the antagonist. And so you have the protagonist who's trying to reach the goal, and the antagonist who's in the way of reaching that goal, and that's called conflict. And conflict is a wonderful thing in storytelling because it's interesting. That central conflict is the engine that drives the story forward and maintains the audience interest. Now listen, you can have films that are more episodic in nature, you certainly can, but that is quite difficult to do because when you're constantly changing the goal, it muddies the plot. So let's make up a story as an example. Let's say that our hero is a guy who wants to find the lost city of Atlantis, right? That's the goal. And you can imagine all sorts of obstacles that he would have to overcome to reach that goal. But let's say 30 minutes into the film, he reaches Atlantis, and he gets some of the treasure there. But then he gets word that his father is dead, and so he has to get back to his hometown in time for the funeral. Well, there's clear conflict, it's a race against time. But then 60 minutes into the film, he gets to his dad's funeral, but then he learns that the factory in town is closing down, and the town is going under. And so our hero needs to petition the mayor and the factory owners, and he rallies the townsfolk, and in the end, he uses the treasure from Atlantis to save the town. Okay, that's a story. There's a beginning, middle, and an end, and it's somewhat tied together. But what would you say is the story about? See, the changing goals muddies the plot, muddies the themes, and confuses the audience. And that's the case with Barbie. Now, you could say that the overarching goal of Barbie is that she wants to solve her existential crisis, which again, not a great goal for a kids' movie. But either way, there's still a problem here because you have to see how the action steps are connected to achieving the goal, because otherwise it's just a series of random events. Let's go back to our story as an example. Our hero wants to find Atlantis. Cut to, He's on a dock talking to his ex-girlfriend because he needs to convince her to let him borrow her father's ship. All right? So we got a lot going on there. You can see opportunity for conflict within the scene, sets up a love interest, character work, exposition. The scene can do a lot, but we understand as an audience how this action step is leading us toward the goal. That's why the goal is the engine that drives the narrative. Okay, let's reset. What if our hero wants to find Atlantis, and then we cut to our hero taking an interpretive dance class? Now that scene, in and of itself, could be entertaining, it could be funny, it could be enjoyable, but it's hard to see how it's related to the goal. And if you have enough scenes strung together that do not seem to be connected to achieving the goal, your audience is most likely going to get bored, frustrated, and irritated. And that's Barbie. Her goal is to solve her existential crisis, and so she needs to deprogram the Barbie so that Barbie Land is back to the way it was at the beginning when she had her existential crisis, because then she will, once and for all... See, set aside the feminism, girl power, rah-rah thing of it. The problem with Barbie is it's sloppy, incompetent storytelling. Next, Killers of the Flower Moon. A Scorsese film with the hallmarks of a Scorsese film. Overly long, cast with his guys with very little regard to the actual role, and deals of course with gangsters and criminal shenanigans. It's Goodfellas again, minus the charm, intrigue, sophistication, or appeal. The story, for what little there is of it, centers on the Osage tribe who are incredibly wealthy because their land sits on oil, and so the dastardly Robert De Niro and his dimwit nephew DiCaprio hatch a sophisticated plot to acquire those oil rights, which involves marriage. Oh, and then a bunch of murder. But eventually, the murders start to raise suspicion as people clue into the fact that perhaps being shot in the back of the head or your house being blown up by dynamite wasn't entirely an accident. So in the end, they get caught, because even though the local town's police and medical doctors are bought off, there's such a thing as federal law enforcement. Now, the heart of the film is DiCaprio and his Osage wife. Despite all his evil doings, the question is whether he actually loved her. Which is a shame, because DiCaprio does a lot of jowl work in this film, pretending that he's Marlon Brando. I despise Leonardo DiCaprio's acting. The only film in which his presence in it has been a net positive is What's Eating Gilbert Grape, Titanic, Wolf of Wall Street, end of list. Everything else, the fact that he's in it makes the film actively worse. Anyway, the film is not bad, it's just not good. It just kind of lies there and it makes you want to poke it with a stick. Just go watch Goodfellas instead. Next, Oppenheimer. I think Christopher Nolan is the best working director right now, which is why I rushed to the theaters to see this work and was, well, completely underwhelmed. The film is segmented in two parts, one called Fission and the other Fusion, which are interwoven timelines. Fission is dealing with the Manhattan Project and the race to the atom bomb, and Fusion is dealing with a security hearing and a Senate confirmation hearing in the 1950s. And while the fission-fusion concept might seem clever, the net effect of it is that only half the film works. The race for the bomb works. It's got everything you need, the key ingredients for compelling storytelling: goals, stakes, urgency. We gotta get the bomb before Hitler does, or we'll lose the war. Goal, stakes, urgency. Works. It always works. And within that, you have the dynamic of Oppenheimer's communist sympathies. We don't like communists, yes, but if he's off the project, Hitler might beat us to the bomb. That plays within the conflict and the tension and as a broader geopolitical manifestation with Russia in World War II. On the downside, it hits the note too many times, replaying the same exact beats. He's a communist, yes, but pragmatism. He's a communist, yes, but pragmatism. He's a communist, yes, but pragmatism. We got it. But overall, it still works. Then Germany surrenders. Goal, stakes, urgency, gone. But it's still pretty effective, because the race is over, the war is in hand, and we've been so invested in this goal, even as an audience, that we haven't seriously considered all the various implications of the atom bomb. And that's a nice pivot point, processing and dealing with the horror and realities of these weapons and the future potential of nuclear war. And there's really captivating imagery and cinematography, and it's quite striking and well done. But what doesn't work is the other half of the film. Half of the film centers on whether or not we'll get the bomb before Hitler. The other half centers on whether or not Oppenheimer will get security clearance. Not exactly the same level of stakes. Oh no, Oppenheimer is going to have the same security clearance as most Americans. Oh, the humanity! Huge consequences for not having him. Remember when we all died from nuclear war? The reality is Oppenheimer was not mistreated. He was a communist and should not have had security clearance, especially because the emerging foes of the age were communist nations. They overlooked his communism because they had to win the war. When the war was over, they reassessed. So the central problem is these two storylines don't really work together. They're not complementary or cohesive thematically. And that makes the film feel more like an empty biography, and I just don't think that Wikipedia pages make for good screenplays. All right, this is running long, and so we'll stop there and get to our top 5 films next week with other thoughts on the Oscars. In the meantime, if you like what we're doing here, like, subscribe, share, tell a friend, buy my latest book, 6 Rounds for the Witching Hour. Links to that are in the show notes. If you read it, leave a glowing review. If you don't read it, leave a glowing review. Follow me on the socials, and I'll see you next time for more Appropriating the Culture.